was actually in Philadelphia earlier this week for the president's speech, and there was a woman standing on the corner with a big Liberty Bell sign that said, "For the people." And she was telling people they got to go out to the rallies in their own states. And I was able to say to her, well, I'm going to be on one in Delaware. So here we are today in Delaware. This morning, I simply came to do two things. One, to remember and honor an incredible man. And two, as a call to action. To remember an incredible man and to have a call to action. And across this country right now, we know that voting rights are under attack. And for me, I was saying to Matt Meyer, our county executive, that this was a challenging morning for me. A couple of people on my team tried to write speeches to help for this event. And I was so weighted down with a heaviness. I could feel John Lewis's spirit, and I could feel him. I could feel him. And even as I look out at all of you, I think of John. I think of the fact that I was blessed to serve with him. I think of the fact that he fought and died and bled for our right to vote, and that he recognized how precious and important it was. And so as I thought about the moment that we're in, that across this country, while voting rights are being attacked, and even according to the Brennan Center for Justice, state voter suppression legislation is happening in over 48 states in our country, over almost 400 bills. Did you hear me? Almost 400 pieces of legislation in 48 states trying to stop us from having the right to vote. And what was it based on? As Claire said, it was based on a big lie. Let me hear you say, the big lie. The big lie was a big lie. Then we got Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act. Gutting it as we speak. And then in Arizona, hard to believe, but people are still trying to count votes? Are you kidding me? They're still trying to count votes. They're looking at bamboo and maybe bringing in pandas. This is incredible to me. Incredible. But we know that the Department of Homeland Security said 2020 was the most secure election we've ever had in our nation. Most secure. Give us a round of applause for that, too. So this morning, hearing John Lewis's spirit, I was reminded of a verse that says the race is not given to the swift nor to the strong, but to the one that endures. To the one that endures. To the one that endures. And you know what he said? It's our time to take the baton. The baton is ours. That's right. Thank you. From gerrymandering, voter suppression, voter subversion, intimidation, and believe me, I know intimidation. Believe me, I do. I am proud that we here today recognize the sense of urgency. Now is the moment. And for those of you who know DJ Khaled, he would probably say, they don't want you to vote. Anybody know DJ Khaled? Any young people in the audience? Thank you, Kobe. They don't want you to vote. But I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of H.R. 1, the For the People Act. I'm proud that I was able to vote on the H.R. 4, the John Lewis Act in the last Congress, and will be voting on it again. Yeah. We know it's things like same-day registration, automatic voter registration, 2 weeks of early voting, returning citizens, and pre-registering young people. Pre-registering young people, our seniors and people with disabilities being able to have that precious vote. Again, the race isn't given to the swift nor to the strong, but to the one that endures. I'm also reminded of a song that they sang during the Civil Rights Movement that we still sing in our churches. It's "Walk Together, Children, Don't You Get Weary." Walk together, children, don't you get weary. Right now, we're feeling a little weary. Some of us are feeling a little weary, but I'm going to tell you, the way we get rid of weary is to walk together. So that's why we're here together. That's why all of these organizations got together. That's why they're doing this across the country. Because we're going to walk together to that great promised land. 50 years ago, John Lewis addressed us at the March on Washington. 50 years later, he was able to stand with the first African American president. And he spoke of racial justice, mass incarceration, immigration, homelessness, poverty, hunger, and voting rights. And as he finished his remarks, he proclaimed, "We must never, ever give up. We must never, ever give in. We must keep the faith and keep our eyes on the prize." So as we mark this 1 year since John left us, I have to tell you, I think about him a lot. I think about his quiet strength, his awesome bravery, his fierce conviction, how he liked to dance to the song Happy. I think about John a lot. I also think of him in the most challenging times. On January 6th, that morning, it was John Lewis who I thought about as I walked into the Capitol. It was John Lewis who I thought about as I sat at my desk trying to determine, should I wear this boot or that boot? Because I don't know what might happen. Not knowing that I was about to face an insurrection and be in the Capitol gallery when it took place stuck. It was John I thought about. It was our ancestors I thought about. It was my parents, like my dad, Ted Blunt. Give my dad a round of applause, doggone it. Thank you, Dad. My grandmothers and my grandfathers. And some of you know I carry this scarf with me from the day that I was sworn in that had that X marked on it to allow my great-great-great-grandfather to have the right to vote from Georgia. From Georgia. The Returns of Qualified Voters and Reconstruction Oath. I still carry it since the day I was sworn in. I carry it as my inspiration and my proof of what we've been through. I think of John often, but I will also tell you that John would tell us, never give up. We find ourselves confronting a lie as big as they come, and we find ourselves confronting those who want to try to sell us suppression cloaked in security. Most secure election ever. So, as we come together to honor John, our commitment is not just to talk the talk, but to walk the walk, to walk together. It is our time to get in necessary good trouble. Necessary good trouble. Now, I'm not talking about scaling the walls of the Capitol crazy trouble. I'm not talking about illegal trouble. I'm not talking about unpatriotic trouble, because that's what that was, unpatriotic. I'm talking about good trouble. The kind of trouble that will make a delegation of legislators stand up and walk out of the chambers and travel across the country to protect the right to vote. That's good trouble. I'm talking about good trouble where the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Joyce Beatty, will stand arm in arm with brothers and sisters and say, we will not be moved until you do something. Good trouble. I'm talking about this kind of good trouble, where we come together as citizens on this day and say we are unified, that we must pass H.R. 1. We are unified that we must have an H.R. 4 and pass H.R. 4 because voting rights are on the table. And we will not let progress be stopped by process. I'm going to say that again in a little way. Process cannot and will not stop progress. I'm going to say it one more time so you get this in your head. Sink in. Process cannot and will not stop progress. Ours is a higher calling. in this important time. As John said, the right to vote is the most sacred right. Folks stood in line for hours through a pandemic, put their lives on the line, And I will tell you, I want you to spread the word. If there were just 2 people out here, I know they would be the right 2 people. But we got you out here, and we got the cameras out here, and we're going to spread the word. Because if people don't get how urgent this moment is, we want them to know. We want them to know that this right is tied to criminal justice reform. This right is tied to health care. This right is tied to a minimum wage increase across this country. This right is tied to child care. This right is tied to our very existence, the ability for us to drink the water and breathe the air and even have a planet to live on. This right is the right to vote, and we need to keep the right to vote. Democracy is our calling, and good trouble is the way. Good trouble. I hear you. So I will close by sharing with you, I was trying to think, I was reading different speeches that John gave, even his last speech, and in his last letter in the New York Times, in that opinion piece, he talked about children walking with the wind. And I didn't understand what that meant. And so as I dug a little deeper, there's a story, and some of you may have heard it, where John was playing with his cousins and his siblings outside on the ground. It was a beautiful day, they're playing, and all of a sudden the clouds start rolling in. A storm starts coming. Y'all ever felt a storm coming? A storm was coming. And so they all ran in the house, and all the family members, all of the fun and joy stopped. And they could hear the thunder, and they could hear the lightning, and they could feel the wind. And they were scared. And all of a sudden, he said he could see the edge of the corner of the house, this little shanty house, just shaking, as if it was about to take off onto the ground, like they were about to be taken like darts. And all of a sudden, his aunt said to them, "Children, grab each other's hands, lock hands, lock hands. And what I want you to do is walk to that side of the room where the danger is, where the wind is about to take up this house." And then they walked there, and it was stable. And then the wind started blowing on another side, and she said, "Children, walk toward the wind." This is our moment. It feels like a storm. We feel like we can't make it. We're afraid the whole house is going to be gone. The House of Representatives, the legislature, you name it. But what he said was, lock hands, walk towards the wind, children. We aren't afraid. We're not afraid. And even if we are, we're still going to walk toward the wind, aren't we? Walk toward that wind. Hold somebody's hand. Hold somebody's hand right now and say, "I got you." Hold somebody's hand. I've got democracy. Hold somebody's hand and know that we are in this together, and we cannot get weary. We must work harder. We must never give up. We must never give in. And we must keep our eyes on the prize. The prize is democracy. The prize is the beloved community. Now get in some good trouble.
Good morning. It's my privilege to be here to speak on behalf of the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice, and also as a member of the coalition founded by Claire for Common Cause and Sherry for for Sierra Club Delaware. On July 13th, President Biden delivered an address on voting rights at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. His words are timely for our purposes today. His words are important, and his words bear repeating. Biden called the right to vote in America the test of our time. Addressing the big lie of election fraud that supports new voter suppression in, we now know, 48 states, he asked, "Are you on the side of truth or lies, fact or fiction, justice or injustice, democracy or autocracy?" Biden called the state-led voter suppression effort the 21st century Jim Crow. And indeed, that's what it is. These new laws ban or restrict voter registration, absentee voting, or vote by mail. They increase local officials' ability to purge voters from the lists of eligible voters. They limit hours for in-person voting. They reduce the number of in-person polling places. They impose criminal liability and huge fines on poll workers for simple mistakes. They change state authority for certifying elections to local partisan county officials. These restrictive voting provisions disproportionately affect people of color, the poor, and yes, even the middle class. They affect all of us. These are the people with long commutes, those having childcare or multi-generational care challenges and responsibilities, multiple jobs, mobility issues, healthcare issues, or business owners or first responders who work 12 or more hour shifts. These provisions affect the people who were considered the essential workers during the pandemic, who worked long hours and would not be able to take off from work to vote during the restrictive hours mandated by these new laws. If these are the citizens who have been described as forgotten, overlooked, and voiceless, what are the real reasons for supporting voting legislation that stops citizens from exercising the right to vote? What is gained from preventing certain classes of hardworking, law-abiding American citizens from voting? Or is the real question, who benefits from excluding certain groups of Americans from voting? These proposals are anti-democratic and are aimed at preserving the status quo in the states proposing them, because enlarging the right to vote and increasing voter turnout on these impacted voters might result in disrupting that status quo. And to further ensure that that doesn't happen, these enacted and proposed voter suppression laws are tinkering with the vote counting process to affect certification of elections. President Biden noted that these legislatures are taking the power to vote, to count the vote, from independent election administrators who work for the people and giving it to polarized state legislators and partisan actors who work for political parties. The For the People Act addresses these problems with provisions ensuring internet registration, automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, voting by mail, and conditions on removal of voters from registration lists. To address concerns about voter fraud, it provides uniform requirements for paper ballots and addresses provisional ballots. You might ask, what does this have to do with Delaware? Our legislature is not proposing or enacting suppressive voting laws, but as Representative Rochester pointed out, our House of Representatives this spring refused to approve HB 75, the constitutional amendment that would remove the requirement for an excuse for absentee voting in our state. The excuses for absentee voting are actually prescribed in our Constitution. If you don't meet them, you can't have an absentee ballot. We can't vote by mail in Delaware. Although the legislature passed automatic voter registration, it did not act on a bill proposing same-day voter registration. The For the People Act addresses these deficits. It also requires independent redistricting commissions, instead of leaving the difficult task of redistricting after a census to the governor and the heads of our political parties. The For the People Act would provide a solution at the national level that would eliminate the need to fight the same battle for democracy in all 50 states. The Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice supports the For the People Act and opposes suppressive voter state legislation, the 21st century Jim Crow, that erodes the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, giving Black people the right to vote. The For the People Act passed the U.S. House of Representatives, but it was not even given a hearing in the Senate. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell used the filibuster to prevent the bill's passage and to prevent even debate about the bill. The filibuster would require a vote of 60 for passage instead of a simple majority. Think about that. The filibuster was used to prevent even a debate, which would have included compromise legislation advanced by Senator Joe Manchin. Senator McConnell has stated in no uncertain terms that the filibuster would be used to defeat any progressive legislation on the Biden agenda. This is anti-democratic and autocratic. It allows the minority party to defeat the proposals of the majority party without discussion, debate, or even the opportunity for amendment. The filibuster should be reformed or eliminated because no party, neither Republican nor Democrat, should be the party that has the power to prevent legislation introduced by the majority party from even being voted on. The filibuster is a relic of the Jim Crow era that is not in the Constitution. The framers considered and rejected supermajority requirements to pass legislation. The filibuster is only a Senate rule. Protecting the freedom of the American people, all of us, is much more important than preserving a Senate rule. We ask you, Senators Carver and Coons, to take the lead in moving the Senate beyond obstructionism by working with your colleagues to fix the filibuster so that it cannot be the barrier that it is now. It must be modified so that we can pass the For the People Act to ensure that the United States is the democracy it claims to be, and to prevent a minority from turning in this country into an autocracy. In closing, I would like to say the time to act is now. As election attorney Mark Ilias reminds us, history will judge us by what we did at this moment to protect our voting rights and democracy. Thank you.
Good morning, Wilmington. Good morning, Wilmington. Good morning, Newcastle County. Good morning, Kent and Sussex County. Thank you so much for coming together today. Let's give a big round of applause to Common Cause, Sierra Club, the Southern Delaware Democratic Alliance, Interfaith, Power and Light, all the groups that came to Indivisible Highlands, all the groups that came together today. I know she left. She promised me she'd be watching online. Let's give it up for our representative, Lisa Blunt Rochester. That is my job isn't exactly a walk in the park, but that's a tough job she has for us in Washington, standing up for us every day. I also want to make sure to highlight, I saw Representative Eric Morrison here today. Give Representative Morrison a round of applause. Thank you. Representative Paul Baumbach is here somewhere, I believe. Representative Baumbach, thank you so much for being here today. Every time I come to Rodney Square, Representative Frank Cook, Cookie, formerly of Newcastle County government. He's one of ours. Thank you. Thank you, Ted. Every time I come to Newcastle County, I think of my experience here. One day in November, back in the 1980s, I was a little kid, and there was a man named Reverend Jesse Jackson speaking right there in Rodney Square. It was a very cold day, like 180-degree opposite of today. And he asked, when he started, there were barriers around, I believe he was running for president at the time. There were barriers around, and he asked the police to take down the barriers so we could all come closer. It's a little hot out today, and I'm still worried about COVID. There are still some COVID cases out there, so we're not going to do that. But he led something that I know many of you remember called the Rainbow Coalition. I thought it was a fantastic name. The Rainbow Coalition. As I look around here, I see our state. I see the state of Delaware, and I see our country in a Rainbow Coalition. To say, we are different than this. We are different than what we see on the news. And we need to pass the For the People Act so that every voice here has a voice in our democracy. Everyone who can go to the polls, gets a ride, can get to the polls, whether here in Wilmington, Delaware, whether in Texas or Georgia or anywhere across this country. My second memory of Jesse Jackson in a park is in Grant Park, Chicago, in 2008. In Grant Park, Chicago, in November 2008, Jesse Jackson, who was known for his power and his strength and his uncompromising actions for justice, he was crying on a night in November of 2008 because they just had announced that Senator Barack Obama would become the next president of the United States. Years later, Reverend Jackson said he never imagined that so much would happen so fast. He never imagined that so much would happen so fast. I always thought that was very interesting. After hundreds of years of struggle, after hundreds of years of slavery, decades of a civil rights movement, Reverend Jackson looked back and said so much had happened so fast. You may wonder why I'm talking about this. We're here to talk about the right to vote. I think at some level, what we're talking about is the most fundamental justices in our country, in our community. It's about saying that everyone, no matter what your history in this land, you deserve an equal say in the annals of power of our country, of our state, our county, and our city. Your great-grandfather may have been a slave. Your grandfather may have been a master. We all deserve an equal shot here in this democracy. You know, Neha, you talked a little bit about not yet being able to vote. Does anyone know anything about preaching to chickens? Anyone know anything about preaching to chickens? My first campaign manager in 2016 was a guy named Rashad Taylor from the great state of Georgia, from Atlanta, Georgia. And when I was doing job interviews, one thing stuck out on his resume, that he'd been an intern. He'd been an intern for Representative John Lewis for 6 or 7 years. And he would often tell me, Matt, the way you learn this job is you preach to chickens. You preach to chickens. And when Representative Lewis was 5 or 6 years old, he lived on a chicken farm. And when his mom was inside cooking dinner and he didn't have much to do, he would say he would go outside, he'd gather the chickens, and he'd preach to the chickens. He'd preach to them about the Lord. He'd preach to them about justice, and he'd preach to them about the change that was going to come. And he would say when the wind blew, the chickens would sway, and he knew he made a point. And the funny thing is, he came to Delaware just a few years before he passed, thanks to Senator Coons, Senator Carper, and Representative Blunt Rochester. And he talked about how that experience, preaching to chickens, developed his vision for what this country could be. He would tell the chickens, it doesn't matter your birthright, it doesn't matter what color chicken you are, it doesn't matter what your fate is going forward, it doesn't matter what kind of eggs you lay, but we are all in this together. So Neha, I tell that story particularly to you because you don't have to be 18 to preach to chickens. You can be a child to stand up and say, this is not what we want our country to be. It takes voice, it takes energy, and it takes action. So I'm here simply to say thank you to every single one of you for coming out today. We need you. We need you to preach to chickens here in Delaware. We need you to preach to chickens in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in Texas, and across this country if we are ever going to achieve the kind of America that we all know is a possibility, but it has never yet been.
How's everyone doing? How's everyone doing? Look, my name's Kobe Owens. I come to you today as your neighbor, your friend, your fellow good troublemaker, and I'm here to make some good noise. Listen, when I was a freshman in college, I had the honor of first meeting Representative John Lewis. And we were in D.C. fighting for immigration reform, and I was among one of the 200 people arrested that day with him, and that's an honor that I will always cherish. But I want to take y'all back, and I want to talk about someone else real quick. I want to take y'all back to the night that Medgar Evers was slain. As he pulled into his driveway a little after midnight, he had just come from an NAACP meeting with attorneys. He exited his vehicle and went to his trunk to retrieve a box of t-shirts for the voter registration rally the next day. Those shirts read, "Jim Crow must go." As he pulled the box out his car, there was a single gunshot that entered his back and out through his heart and out his chest. He fell into his car, and then he crawled 30 feet to his door where his wife found him. And as he laid there dying in his own blood, his wife rushed him to the hospital in Mississippi. He was the first African American to be admitted to that hospital and to be treated. But the reason why I bring him up today, and why I think about that night, June 12, 1963, is because here today, we're faced with the same forces of voter oppression and voter suppression that took his life. The same forces that Doc King fought against. The same forces that led John Lewis to march across that bridge. We are facing unprecedented voter suppression laws across this country right now. Our voting rights are in peril at this very moment. And we must stand here as constituents of Delaware and stand with the people across this country to demand our voices are heard, that our elected officials work to ensure that they are working to pass the For the People Act, and that if we don't fight back, more and more Americans will become disenfranchised and lose their right and their voice in our democracy. Despite decades of progress, impediments to exercise the right to vote persist in many states, especially in communities of color. That's why we need federal protections and safeguards to safeguard our fundamental rights as Americans. For far too long, states have passed legislation that limits voting rights. And I believe it's time that states start doing the opposite to make it easier and more accessible to get to the ballot box. In 2020, we the people came together to work the polls, to get out the vote, to cast our ballots in spite of a pandemic, achieving historic levels of voter participation. Our communities are proud of the roles that we played, encouraging our neighbors to go out. But see, when it comes to the For the People Act, the only way this bill will get passed is by ending once and for all what President Obama called a Jim Crow relic. Historically, the filibuster has been used to block civil rights legislation and protect the interests of the minority over the will of the majority. If the filibuster remains in place, Republicans will be free to dismantle voting rights across this nation and flip the House by drawing their own congressional districts. To put it simply, Senate Democrats will soon be faced with a choice. Save our democracy or save the filibuster. Democrats have the power to stop a wave of voter suppression laws sweeping this country. And that starts by passing the For the People's Act, which will guarantee access to early and absentee voting, end partisan gerrymandering, and limit the influence of money in politics. And I truly believe now is that time. So if you believe that as well, if you believe that creating automatic voter registration that requires people to opt out instead of opt in, let me hear some noise. If you believe every state should have the online portal for voter registration, let me hear some noise. If you believe every state should have open early voting that has 15 days of early voting and sites open for at least 10 hours, let me hear some noise. If you believe no state should have restrictive access to voting by mail or require certain conditions to qualify to vote by mail, let me hear some noise. If you believe restoring voting rights to convicted felons who have served their sentence, let me hear some noise. If you believe it is time to end the Jim Crow filibuster and pass the For the People Act, the John Lewis Voter Advancement Act, and D.C. statewide, let me hear some noise. If it is time for some necessary trouble, some good trouble, in order to get this done, who will stand with me? Because it's a revolutionary summer. Our democracy is on the line. Let me hear some noise if you're willing to fight for it. Thank y'all so much.
Let me hear it for the good troublemakers. Y'all not loud enough. Let me hear it for the good troublemakers. All right. I'm here representing the United Methodist Church in particular, but I'm representing the Christian faith in general. And also I'm representing all people of faith and folks of no faith who are folks who love justice and righteousness. I stand together with my fellow Christians, my fellow people of the Jewish faith and the Islamic faith and the Hindu faith and the Baha'i faith and other faiths and all those who love justice and righteousness and fairness and equality. I stand here on this day to affirm the right to vote for all citizens as a basic human right. We want to hold governments rightfully responsible for the protection of the rights of the people for free and fair elections. We declare that both the form and the leaders of all governments should be determined by the exercise of the right to vote for guaranteed for every single citizen in this nation. I stand here on this day appalled and outraged because of the discriminatory practices against underrepresented communities. I also further assert that the right of historically underrepresented racial and ethnic persons we ought to be standing up for them on this day. You think about folks like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you think about Representative John Lewis, those who in the past spoke so eloquently and passionately, those who espouse what we are espousing here today. I want you to know that even when those who have gone on to glory, who stood up for what is right and just, they pass it on to our generation to stand up for what is right and just. How many folk here today are here to declare that they will never back down, that they will never give in, and they will never give up? We are calling for a vision of a beloved community founded on economic and racial justice. We're calling for a vision that includes reinstating and strengthening voting rights protection in light of this continued systemic racism that threatens and undermines the provisions for fair and free elections for all citizens. I want you to know, my sisters and brothers, that our whole society will falter if we continue to allow repressive and oppressive-minded politicians to use people as political pawns by playing on the fear of underrepresented communities. There are many in the halls of Congress this day who are pushing for oppression and repression. They would love to see us roll back the clock to the 1950s. They would love to see black and brown people under the yoke of white supremacy. I'm here to declare that these things are evil to the core. I call upon the consciousness and the courage of people of every ethnic group, every religious group, to stand up for what is right and just, to resist the demonic and power-hungry game that puts our very nation at peril and that threatens innocent souls everywhere with a hell right here on earth. We further oppose the disenfranchisement of formerly incarcerated folks. We know that the incarceration rate disproportionately impacts the black and brown community, disenfranchised folks, and we know a church and a community of justice and righteousness calls on local and national government to restore the citizenship rights of everyone, including the right to vote for U.S. citizens who have felony convictions. The Church of Justice and Righteousness deplores the widespread use of the lie, yes, the lie of election fraud as a ruse to disenfranchise people, to create a situation that impedes and hinders and damages the very idea of democracy. I want you to know, those of you who are standing here today as freedom fighters, I want you to know that we stand together as one so that we might pass laws that keep the will of the people in the objective, and those who want to see those things go by the wayside, we're here to tell them and to declare to them on this day that we're not going away, we're not giving up, and we're not giving in. Campaign finance reform is a moral matter for the religious community. The temptation to buy favors is an ancient and unjust one, addressed often in the scriptures. The Hebrew Bible has 8th century prophet Amos thundering against those merchants in his society who, he says, have sold the innocent for silver. Those who have sold the innocent for silver. Those who have pushed away the afflicted. Amos said that God is not pleased with empty worship rituals, but please, when justice would roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And so therefore I declare, along with all of you freedom fighters and those who dare to practice this thing that we call justice, in order to expand voting rights, in order to change campaign finance laws, in order to reduce the influence of money in politics, in order to ban partisan gerrymandering, and in order to create new ethic rules for federal office holders, we demand the passage of For the People Act, and we demand it right now. And finally, I'm here to encourage you this way, to tell you that we know that we shall win. We shall overcome. We know and we are confident that we will win because good always wins over evil. So let's get it done. Let's pass the For the People Act. Let's get it done now, not later. Now is the time. Now. No justice, no peace.